Okay, let's dive right in with a puzzle that really gets to the heart of our investigation. Just think about it. We're talking about Augustus, the very first Roman emperor. This man commanded legions, he built cities out of marble, he ruled a massive chunk of the known world. But there was one thing, one absolutely critical task that was completely beyond his power. Any guesses?
And there it is. The most powerful man on earth couldn't convince his own people, especially the wealthy ruling class, to have enough children to keep the empire going. Now, this wasn't just some minor social issue. It was a deep, internal crisis that haunted Rome for centuries before its final collapse. And that, right there, is our first major clue.
So let's treat this like a proper cold case investigation. We'll start at the official time of death, the year 476 CE. That's when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer kicked out the last Roman emperor in the West. But was that the moment Rome actually died?
Well, here's the thing. The consensus among historians today is that 476 wasn't a sudden murder. It was more like the final breath after a very long illness. The empire didn't just fall over one day. It unraveled, thread by thread, over many, many generations. So, our job is to examine the evidence and find the real cause of death.
Every good investigation starts by rounding up the usual suspects. And when it comes to the fall of Rome, there are two big ones that pretty much everyone has heard of: invading barbarians and, of course, moral decay. But do these classic theories actually hold up?
First up, the barbarian invasions. The classic storybook ending, hordes of warriors pouring over the borders and smashing civilization to bits. But the modern view is a lot more complex. Yeah, the pressure on the borders was real, but it was a problem Rome had handled for centuries. The real issue was internal. By the late Empire, Rome couldn't find enough Romans to fill the ranks of its army. The invasions, then, were more of a symptom of a body that was already too weak to fight off an infection.
And what about suspect number 2, moral decadence? The idea that the empire just got too luxurious and lazy, famously pushed by the historian Edward Gibbon. Well, the academic consensus today has pretty much thrown that idea out. It's now seen more as a rhetorical device, basically something that early Christian writers used to criticize pagan Rome, than an actual verifiable cause for the collapse.
Okay, so if it wasn't the usual suspects, what was it? This brings us to a clue that Roman leaders themselves were totally obsessed with. Their population was shrinking. This wasn't some external threat, it was a crisis brewing right in the heart of the empire.
And what's really remarkable here is the timing. This wasn't some last-minute panic in the 400s. The alarm bells were ringing all the way back during the reign of Augustus, the very first emperor. He looked around and saw that the noble families, the very backbone of the Roman state, were not having enough kids, and he knew it was an existential threat.
Augustus took this so seriously, he enacted some pretty sweeping social legislation. The absolute centerpiece of it all was a special legal status called the jus trium liberorum. That translates to the right of 3 children. This wasn't just a friendly suggestion. It was a massive, state-sponsored campaign to reverse this population decline.
And this just brilliantly shows you how desperate the state was. I mean, look at these privileges. For men, okay, you could get out of some tedious public duties. But for women? Wow, this was revolutionary. If a woman had 3 children, she was freed from the legal control of a male guardian, and she gained significant inheritance rights. The state was basically trying to bribe its citizens with freedom and money just to have more kids.
But here's the thing. Despite these incredible efforts by Augustus and the emperors who came after him, the decline continued. The laws didn't work, so our investigation has to ask the really critical question: why? Why were the Romans disappearing? What was causing this long, slow drain on their population? While the evidence points not to one single culprit, but to a whole cascade of devastating blows. First, you get the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century, which may have wiped out millions. Then you get the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years of non-stop civil war and chaos. And to top it all off, the climate itself turned against them, with the start of the late antique Little Ice Age, making farming harder and life just generally more miserable.
And the key takeaway here is that these weren't just temporary setbacks. The one-two punch of plague and war had a catastrophic and, more importantly, a long-term effect on the population. It created a permanent shortage of people. Not enough farmers for the fields, not enough taxpayers for the government, and, crucially, not enough recruits for the army.
Now, here's a more controversial, but really fascinating piece of forensic evidence. Some researchers have suggested that a silent killer was at work: chronic lead poisoning. The Roman elite used lead in everything: their water pipes, their pottery, even to sweeten their wine. The theory goes that this constant, low-level exposure could have lowered fertility rates and damaged their health, basically weakening the ruling class from the inside out.
So, what happens to a highly complex civilization when it starts running out of people? Well, the very systems that hold it all together, the army, the economy, the government, they all start to fail. It's like a predictable, cascading domino effect.
Let's just walk through this vicious cycle, because it's really a death spiral. Step 1, you have fewer people. That means fewer farmers, so less food gets grown. It also means fewer taxpayers, so government income drops like a rock. With less money, the state can't pay its soldiers or fix the roads. This leads to a weaker army that has to hire non-Roman mercenaries, which makes it harder to defend the borders, which leads to more instability and, you guessed it, even further population decline.
Scholars actually have a name for this whole process. They call it deinstitutionalization. It sounds a bit academic, but what it really means is the slow-motion collapse of all the complex systems that make a big civilization work. Trade networks dry up, the money becomes worthless, laws don't get enforced. It's the process by which a sophisticated society literally falls apart into a much simpler, more local world.
So what's the final verdict in our cold case? Well, it wasn't a single killer. It was a long, slow death from 1,000 cuts, and all of them were rooted in a fundamental demographic crisis. And maybe the most chilling part of this whole investigation is what it might tell us about our own time.
This quote from Ansel Lindner just hits you right between the eyes. Augustus, arguably the most powerful man in the world at the time, tried to use top-down government policies to fix his society's birth rate, and he failed completely. With many developed nations today facing their own population declines, it raises a really profound question. Can you ever use policy to reverse a deep-seated cultural trend?
Ultimately, the fall of Rome is a powerful and maybe even a sobering lesson. It suggests that the true foundation of any great power isn't just its army or its economy or its technology. It's the people, their health, their numbers, and their collective will to sustain their civilization for the next generation. And that leaves us with a pretty provocative question to think about. What are the foundations of our own civilization, and just how strong are they really?